There are places a human body should not be found. A commercial freezer, the trunk of a submerged car, the forgotten corners of a derelict building. But perhaps the most unnerving of all is a place crafted by nature itself, a space so tight and unforgiving that it seems impossible for a person to have entered it, let alone two. A narrow fissure in the earth, a vertical crack in a sheer rock face deep in the remote wilderness of Cold Spring Canyon, is one of those places. It was here, wedged into the stone like a fossil, that a mystery that had haunted a community for nearly 2 decades finally gave up its dead. The story began not with horror, but with hope. It began with 24-year-old Chris Stevens and his 22-year-old girlfriend, Brandy Summers. They were a young couple in the familiar and comfortable rhythm of early love, building a life together, one small step at a time. Chris was a talented mechanic, known for his steady hands and an easygoing smile that could put anyone at ease. Brandy was finishing her studies in elementary education, her future dedicated to shaping young minds, her personality a bright and infectious mix of optimism and kindness. They were not expert adventurers or thrill-seekers. They were ordinary people who enjoyed the simple pleasure of escaping the city for the quiet majesty of the natural world. Their plan for that crisp autumn Saturday was beautifully simple. They intended to take a day hike along the well-marked trails of Cold Spring Canyon, a popular recreational area known for its scenic vistas and challenging but manageable terrain. They were going to pack sandwiches and water, take some photos with a disposable camera, and be back in their small apartment by nightfall. It was a plan shared by thousands of others on any given weekend, a mundane and joyful excursion that held no hint of the abyss that awaited them. The discovery of their skeletal remains, 18 years later, intertwined in a rock crevice barely a foot wide, transformed their simple story into a chilling paradox of love, loss, and unimaginable violence. The morning of their departure was unremarkable, marked only by the casual routines of any weekend adventure. Brandy made a quick call to her mother, Sharon, just before they left. She recounted their plans with cheerful excitement, describing the trail they had picked out on a map and promising to call that evening upon their return. She mentioned that Chris had just serviced his old pickup truck and they were looking forward to the drive. It was a conversation filled with the mundane details that formed the bedrock of family life, the kind of call a mother cherishes and, in this case, would replay in her mind for thousands of tormented days to come. It was the last time anyone in their families would ever hear their voices. They drove out to the canyon under a clear, bright sky. Cold Spring Canyon was a place of stark and brutal beauty. Its landscape was carved by time, a rugged expanse of steep rock walls, dense chaparral, and winding trails that could quickly become confusing to the uninitiated. The air was clean, the silence broken only by the cry of a hawk or the rustle of unseen creatures in the underbrush. It was a place that felt ancient and indifferent, a wilderness that promised solitude but also demanded respect. It was vast enough to swallow secrets, and remote enough to keep them. As Chris parked his truck in the gravel lot at the trailhead, they were just one of many cars, another couple seeking a temporary escape, unaware that their escape would become permanent. The first sign that something was wrong was silence. Evening came and went, with no phone call from Brandy. Her mother, Sharon, initially quelled the rising tide of worry with rationalizations. Perhaps they had misjudged the length of the hike. Maybe they stopped for dinner on the way back and had forgotten to call. Cell phone reception in the canyon area was notoriously poor. Their phones were likely dead or out of service range. She told herself to wait, to not overreact. But as the hours bled into the late night, the silence from her daughter grew heavier, more ominous. Calls to both Brandy's and Chris's phones went directly to voicemail. By the next morning, The gnawing anxiety had blossomed into full-blown panic. Sharon contacted Chris's parents, who confirmed they had not heard from their son either. The shared dread was immediate and absolute. They knew the couple was responsible. They knew they would have called if they could. A call was made to the county sheriff's department, and within hours, the official machinery of a search and rescue operation ground into life. The report was filed, 2 hikers overdue from a trip into Cold Spring Canyon. The initial assessment was cautiously optimistic. Most overdue hikers were found within 24 hours, usually suffering from minor dehydration, a twisted ankle, or simple disorientation. The search began at dawn on Monday. It quickly escalated into a massive undertaking, a testament to the community's fear and the canyon's formidable reputation. The sheriff's department coordinated the effort, deploying deputies and trained search and rescue volunteers. Ground teams, equipped with maps and radios, began the painstaking process of sweeping the main trails, their calls echoing through the quiet ravines. A helicopter was brought in, its rotors chopping the air as it flew low over the terrain, its crew scanning the landscape for any splash of color that did not belong a piece of clothing, a backpack, a sign of human life. Canine units were deployed, their handlers working the dogs along the edges of the trails, hoping they might pick up a scent. Hundreds of volunteers joined the official search crews, ordinary citizens compelled to help find the missing couple. They combed through dense brush, peered over the edges of steep cliffs, and followed dry creek beds. The search was methodical, exhaustive, and profoundly frustrating. The canyon seemed to mock their efforts. Its sheer scale was overwhelming, a labyrinth of rock and scrubland that offered up a million potential hiding places. Every promising lead dissolved into nothing. Every potential trail turned into a dead end. Investigators looked into other possibilities, trying to find a reason for the couple's disappearance that did not involve the unforgiving wilderness. Early theories were considered and systematically dismantled. Had they decided to run away together? A check of their bank accounts and credit cards showed no activity since the morning they left. Their apartment was untouched, clothes were laid out, dishes were in the sink, and Brandy's school books were open on the kitchen table. This was not the scene of a planned departure. The most plausible theory, and the one investigators clung to, was that they had suffered a tragic accident. Perhaps they had wandered off the trail, become disoriented, and fallen from a ledge. It was a common and heartbreaking scenario in this kind of terrain. Yet, despite meticulous searches of the most dangerous cliffs and ravines, they found nothing. There was no sign of a fall, no scuff marks on the rocks, no broken branches, no trace of their presence. It was as if Chris Stevens and Brandy Summers had walked onto the trail and simply evaporated. A week into the increasingly desperate search, investigators made the first and only significant discovery. A deputy patrolling the outer parking lots found Chris's pickup truck parked at the far end of the trailhead lot. It was locked and undisturbed. The discovery was a double-edged sword. It confirmed they had made it to the canyon and begun their hike from that specific location. But it also erased any hope that they had simply changed their plans and gone somewhere else. The truck's presence was a silent, grim testament to the fact that whatever had happened to them had happened out there in the wilderness. Crime scene investigators carefully processed the vehicle, but it offered no clues. Inside, they found a half-empty bottle of water, a crumpled fast food bag, and a local road map. There were no signs of a struggle, no notes, nothing to suggest foul play or distress. The discovery of the truck allowed the search teams to narrow their focus, concentrating their efforts on the network of trails that began at that parking lot. They re-swept the same areas with renewed urgency, going over every square foot of ground again and again. Helicopters with thermal imaging cameras flew missions at night, hoping to detect the faint heat signature of a human body against the cooling ground. But the result was the same: nothing. As the second week of the search drew to a close, a sense of hopelessness began to settle over everyone involved. The odds of finding the couple alive were plummeting with each passing day. The official, large-scale operation was eventually and reluctantly called off. The sheriff promised the families that it would remain an open missing persons case, that deputies would continue to patrol the area, but the massive, coordinated effort was over. The canyon had won. The posters featuring the smiling, hopeful faces of Chris and Brandy, tacked to telephone poles and community bulletin boards, began to fade and peel in the sun. Weeks turned into months, and months bled into years. The vibrant, active search for Chris and Brandy slowly cooled into a forgotten file in a cabinet. For their families, the sharp agony of the initial disappearance subsided into a chronic, dull ache of not knowing. Every phone call from an unknown number sparked a flicker of hope, and every story of discovered human remains brought a wave of fresh dread. Their lives were suspended in a terrible limbo, unable to grieve, unable to move on. In the local community, the story of the missing hikers became a piece of folklore, a cautionary tale told to children about the dangers of the canyon, a ghost story whispered around campfires. 18 years passed. An entire generation grew up with the legend of the couple who walked into the wilderness and never came out. The break in the case came not from a determined detective or a deathbed confession, but by sheer dumb luck. It came in the form of two amateur geologists, men who spent their weekends exploring the remote, off-trail corners of the canyon, looking for interesting rock formations. They were far from any designated path, scrambling over boulders in a lesser-known section of the park, an area the original search parties had likely missed. It was a place you would only go if you were intentionally leaving the trail behind. One of the men, seeking shelter from the wind to light a cigarette, noticed a dark, vertical line in a massive rock outcropping. It was a fissure, a natural crack in the stone, almost completely obscured by overgrown manzanita bushes. Curiosity got the better of him. The opening was incredibly narrow, no wider than his shoulders. He pulled out a powerful flashlight from his pack and aimed a beam into the darkness. The light cut through the gloom, illuminating a tight, vertical shaft that descended into the earth. At first, he saw nothing but rock and shadow. But then, as he angled the beam further down, something caught the light. It was pale and unnaturally smooth. It looked like a branch, but its shape was wrong. He called his friend over, and together they stared into the crevice. A sickening realization dawned on them. It was not a branch. It was a bone. A human bone. The recovery was a slow, grim, and technically demanding operation. The county sheriff's department secured the scene, and a specialized forensic anthropology team was called in. The fissure was too narrow for a person to enter, so they had to use cameras on long poles to assess the situation. The images that came back were stunning and horrifying. Deep inside the crevice, wedged tightly about 15 feet down, were not one, but two human skeletons. They were almost completely articulated, their bones intertwined in a way that suggested they had been forced into the space together. It took the team 2 full days, using specialized grappling tools and rigging, to carefully extract the fragile remains from their stone tomb. The skeletons were transported to the medical examiner's office. Alongside the bones, the recovery team had found scraps of deteriorated clothing and a single water-damaged hiking boot. The mystery of where Chris and Brandy had been for 18 years was finally solved. Dental records were quickly retrieved from the old missing persons file, and within hours, the forensic odontologist made the positive identification. The remains belonged to Christopher Stevens and Brandelia Summers. For the families, The news was a devastating end to a long and agonizing wait. Their children had been found, but the relief of discovery was immediately overshadowed by a new and more terrible question. How did they get in there? The initial theory, favored by the deputies at the scene, was that it had been a freak accident. Perhaps the couple had been climbing on the rocks above. One of them slipped and fell into the crevice, and the other fell in while trying to help. It was a tragic but plausible explanation. It offered a kind of closure, a story of love and misfortune in the face of an indifferent wilderness. But this comforting theory was systematically dismantled on the cold steel table of the forensic anthropologist's lab. The bones had a story to tell, and it was not one of an accident. The forensic examination revealed the true violent nature of their deaths. Chris's skeleton showed multiple fractures on the skull, consistent with repeated blows from a heavy, blunt object. These were not injuries one would sustain in a simple fall. There were defensive wounds on his forearms, indicating he had tried to shield himself from an attack. Brandy's remains told an even more chilling story. Her hyoid bone, a small, U-shaped bone in the neck, was fractured. A fractured hyoid is a classic and powerful indicator of manual strangulation. It was an unmistakable signature of homicide. They had not fallen. They had been beaten and strangled. They were murdered. The discovery re-energized the cold case. It was no longer a missing persons investigation. It was a double homicide. Detectives from the sheriff's cold case unit reopened the 18-year-old files. They looked at the case with fresh eyes, filtering every piece of information through the new, terrifying lens of murder. Who would have wanted to harm this young, happy couple? They had no known enemies, no involvement in drugs or crime. The motive seemed to be tied to the location itself. The attack had to have been random, an encounter with a predator in the wilderness. Detectives began a painstaking review of every person of interest, every tip, and every field interview report from the original investigation. They started by mapping out all the properties that bordered the expansive Cold Spring Canyon Park area back at the time of the disappearance. They cross-referenced property owners with criminal records, looking for anyone with a history of violence, trespassing disputes, or mental instability. The work was tedious, a search for a needle in a haystack 2 decades old. But then, a veteran detective, digging through a box of unorganized ancillary notes from the original file, found something. It was a brief, handwritten entry from a deputy who had taken an anonymous tip a few months after the disappearance. The tipster had mentioned a local eccentric, a man named Elias Thorne, who lived in a ramshackle cabin on a piece of land that abutted the park. The caller claimed Thorne had been acting paranoid and had threatened some teenagers for hiking too close to his property line around the same time the couple vanished. The tip was vague and, in the midst of the massive search for a presumed accident, had been deemed a low priority. It was never followed up on. Elias Thorne immediately became the prime suspect. Investigators discovered that Thorne, now in his late 60s, still lived in the same dilapidated cabin on the same piece of land. He had lived a reclusive, isolated life for decades. He had a minor criminal record, a handful of charges for brandishing a weapon and making criminal threats, all related to hikers or hunters he believed were trespassing on his property. He was a loner, a man known to the few locals who remembered him as territorial, angry, and deeply paranoid. He fit the profile of a hidden monster, a man capable of exploding into violence over a perceived slight. Detectives began quiet surveillance on his property, piecing together his life and history while they built a case for a search warrant. After several weeks of renewed investigation, a judge signed the warrant. A team of deputies and detectives descended on Elias Thorne's isolated property at dawn. The cabin was even more decrepit up close, a collapsing structure surrounded by rusted scrap metal and overgrown weeds. It was a place frozen in time, a monument to decay and isolation. Thorne himself was frail and unkempt, a ghost from another era who seemed surprised and bewildered by the intrusion. He was detained while the team began a methodical search of the house and the surrounding property. The cabin's interior was cluttered and filthy, filled with stacks of old newspapers and junk. The search seemed fruitless at first, but in a damp, musty shed behind the main cabin, a detective noticed a large, rusty metal tool chest. It was locked with an old padlock. After forcing it open, they began sifting through its contents: old tools, rags, and empty oil cans. Buried at the very bottom, wrapped in a moldy canvas tarp, was a small weathered leather backpack. It was a woman's backpack, small and simple, its style clearly from a different decade. The detective's heart hammered in his chest. Inside the backpack, the team found the damning evidence they were looking for. There was a disposable camera. Miraculously, the film inside, while degraded, was partially salvageable. The forensics lab was able to develop it. The photos were grainy and discolored, but the images were unmistakable. They were the last pictures Chris and Brandy ever took. There were photos of them smiling at the trailhead, a picture of Brandy pointing at a deer, and a final, blurry shot of the canyon vista. Tucked into a side pocket of the backpack was another item, preserved in the dry leather: Brandy Summers' driver's license. Thorne had kept it. It was his trophy. Faced with the irrefutable evidence of the backpack and its contents, Elias Thorne was arrested and brought in for interrogation. He was no longer the frail, confused old man from the cabin. In the sterile interview room, he became sullen and defiant. For hours, he denied everything. But as the detectives calmly and methodically laid out the evidence, the location of his property, his history of threatening hikers, and finally, the backpack and the photographs, his facade began to crack. His denials grew weaker, his anger fading into a cold, flat resignation. And then he began to talk. His confession was delivered in a monotone voice, devoid of any emotion or remorse. He told the detectives that on that Saturday afternoon 18 years ago, he had been patrolling the edge of his property when he saw the young couple. They had wandered off the main trail and were having a picnic lunch just inside his property line. To his paranoid mind, they were not innocent hikers. They were intruders, government spies, or thieves casing his property. He confronted them, screaming at them to leave. Chris Stevens, trying to de-escalate the situation, stood up to talk to him. Thorne said he felt disrespected. In a fit of rage, he picked up a large rock and struck Chris in the head. When Brandy screamed, he lunged at her, silencing her by clamping his hands around her throat. The violence was as sudden as it was senseless. He had murdered 2 people over a few feet of dirt. Panicked, he waited until nightfall. Under the cover of darkness, he dragged their bodies deep into the canyon to a remote spot he knew from his years of exploring the area. He knew about the narrow rock fissure, a place he figured no one would ever find. With immense effort, he forced their bodies down into the crevice, wedging them into the earth to hide his crime forever. He took Brandy's backpack as a souvenir of his power, a secret token of his terrible act. He had lived with that secret for 18 years, just a few miles from where the families of his victims lived with their uncertainty. His motive was a pathetic and banal cocktail of paranoia, rage, and territorialism. Elias Thorne was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Given his advanced age and the overwhelming evidence against him, he accepted a plea agreement to avoid a trial, sparing the families the trauma of hearing the graphic details of their children's last moments replayed in a courtroom. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive terms of life in prison, with no possibility of parole. The legal system had delivered its final, definitive judgment. He would die in prison, the last chapter of his bitter, isolated life spent behind bars. The resolution of the case brought a measure of closure, but it was a cold and hollow comfort. For 18 years, the families of Chris Stevens and Brandy Summers had been haunted by a question mark. The truth, when it was finally revealed, was in many ways more horrific than any scenario they could have imagined. Their children's lives had not been claimed by a tragic accident or the unforgiving power of nature, but had been extinguished in a meaningless, brutal moment by the petty rage of a disturbed man. A day that began with the promise of sunshine and simple joy ended in unimaginable terror, all because they chose the wrong spot to eat a sandwich. Their story serves as a chilling reminder that the greatest monsters are not mythical beasts lurking in the shadows of the wilderness, but are sometimes just men, living quiet lives of hateful paranoia, waiting for the world to trespass.